My name is Rowan Blake, and this is how I found out I didn't belong, not to them anyway, not even at my father's memorial. They'd rented out the entire Veterans Hall. Flags everywhere, military brass, folded chairs arranged in perfect lines. I showed up an hour early because I'd helped plan it, booked the space, chose the casket, arranged the music Dad used to hum under his breath. But when my mother arrived, she didn't look at me, didn't ask how I was, didn't say thank you. She just brushed past in her tailored black suit, gripping my brother's arm like they were the only two names on the family tree. Caleb, her golden boy, the one who always got a second chance, the one who couldn't name our dad's favorite war novel if his life depended on it. I stepped forward quietly. "After the service," I said, "can we talk about the will?" That's when she turned. Right there in front of Miles, my partner, my witness, in front of two family friends. She smiled thinly. "Rowan, we've already handled it. You're not needed for the reading." Like I was some ex-employee showing up at a boardroom she no longer had keys to. Like the 2 years I spent keeping my father alive meant nothing. Like love had an expiration date, and I'd missed mine. That was the moment I realized. They thought they'd erased me, but they forgot who taught me how to fight back and who left the real keys behind. Caleb Blake was the kind of man people forgave before he even apologized. He had that easy grin, that just-out-of-bed charm, the kind of swagger small towns mistake for ambition. Growing up, he never had to ask for anything twice. New bike? He's a growing boy. Missed a deadline? Boys will be boys. Crashed Dad's truck during a bonfire dare? He's just figuring things out. Meanwhile, I was expected to figure myself out in silence. I got straight A's, never missed curfew, learned how to rewire a circuit breaker by 13. When I brought home a scholarship letter, my mom said, "Well, of course, you were always the bookish one." No celebration, no cake, just a glance toward Caleb and a sigh, like she wished I'd left a little luck for him. After high school, I left for law school in Denver. Paid for it myself. No handouts, no guilt trips, just long nights, student loans, and my father's quiet encouragement. He'd call once a week, always on Sundays. Not long conversations, just enough. "You eaten?" "Staying sharp." "I keep a photo of you in my toolbox." But Caleb stayed home, didn't go to college, didn't really work either. He had projects. Landscaping gigs, flip this house dreams. Mom said he was entrepreneurial. What he really was a financial black hole. My dad once gave him $15,000 to start a concrete business. It collapsed in 6 months. Next, it was a food truck, except he never got around to buying the truck. Each failure ended the same, with my mother writing it off as a learning experience. When Dad retired from the Marines and opened his own garage, he offered Caleb a part-time job. Caleb lasted 3 weeks, but none of that seemed to matter. In my mother's eyes, he was still the heir, the man of the house. Even when Dad had to get a second job to cover Caleb's credit card debt. Even when I sent money to help with bills, quietly, without being asked. And yet, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Sunday dinner, the same photo sat on the mantel. Caleb shaking hands with the mayor at a high school football banquet. No photos of Dad in uniform. No photos of me graduating with honors. Just that handshake proof, I guess, that he once made someone proud. What they didn't know was this: Caleb could charm a crowd. But he couldn't fake integrity. And when the day came that Dad needed someone, really needed someone, it was Caleb who showed up. It was me. It started with a stumble. Not a dramatic collapse, just a quiet fall on the back porch, one foot slipping off the step Dad built himself 20 years earlier. He waved it off. "Just a bruise," he said, but by the end of the week, he was limping. By the end of the month, he couldn't stand without the railing. They said it was spinal compression. Surgery wasn't ideal at his age, and recovery would be slow if it happened at all. Mom called me once, just once. "Your father's having trouble getting around," she said. Then, as if it were an afterthought, "And I'm not equipped for all this. You've always been good with medical things, right?" I left Denver the next morning. At first, it was just temporary. I told my firm I'd work remotely. 2 months, maybe 3. but 3 months turned into 2 years. I handled the meds, the physical therapy appointments, the incontinence pads, the army of rotating nurses and aides who never stayed more than 2 weeks. I cooked his meals, tracked his vitals, shaved his face when his hands shook too much. Sometimes, I'd find him staring out the window at the old mailbox he'd fixed a dozen times, like he was trying to remember what it felt like to stand tall. Caleb, he came by twice, once to borrow a power drill, once to ask if Dad had any military contacts for a security startup he was pitching. And my mother, she started booking spa weekends, brunches, self-care, she called it. I remember one afternoon, I found a brochure on the kitchen counter, a retreat in Sedona with chakra bowls and hot stone therapy. He wouldn't enjoy that anyway, she said when I asked. He just sits all day, it's too much. For me, she said it like he was a burden, not a man who served 20 years in uniform and never missed a mortgage payment. But Miles understood. He was the only one who did. We hadn't spoken much since college, just the occasional email, a check-in every few birthdays. But when he heard about my dad, he drove up from New Mexico, brought a thermos of strong coffee, and sat with us in silence. That became a ritual. Thursday nights. Me, Miles, and Dad, 3 chairs under the porch light, wrapped in fleece blankets, listening to the quiet hum of rural Utah. Dad liked him. Didn't say much, but the way he looked at Miles was the same way he used to look at a freshly tuned engine, respectful, trusting. And somewhere in those nights, something shifted between Miles and me. Not in a hurry, not like the movies, but steady, like a fuse quietly burning toward something we hadn't named yet. One evening, while changing the linens in Dad's room, I found a small wooden box tucked under the bed frame. Not locked, just waiting. I didn't open it then. I couldn't, not yet, because something told me the moment I did, the goodbye would begin. He passed on a Thursday morning. The hospice nurse had just left. I was folding laundry, nothing special, just socks and the flannel pajama pants he liked most. I walked into his room and the air felt still. Not heavy, not sad, just still. His chest rose once more, then stopped. No gasp, no struggle, just a man exiting the world the way he'd lived in it with quiet dignity. I sat by his bed for a long time, not crying, just holding space, holding his hand like I had every night for months. And when I finally stood, the room felt colder. The next day, after the death certificate was signed, after the transport van pulled away, I opened the wooden box beneath his bed. Inside, everything was organized. My father, the man who once arranged his socket wrenches by millimeter and shine level, had left me a blueprint. At the top, a handwritten letter, faded in spots but legible. His handwriting was slow but careful, like each word was a gear he needed to fit perfectly in place. Ro, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I didn't want to leave messes, so I left you instructions. Not because I thought you owed me anything, but because I trust you to do the right thing, even when they won't. The house is yours, the account is yours. The cabin in Kanab is yours too, you'll find the deed inside. I didn't leave Caleb out to punish him. I just couldn't leave anything in hands that never held the truth. Don't fight them, don't scream. Just show them the paperwork and walk away. You've already given more than anyone ever should. Love you always. Dad. Behind the letter were 3 folders. 1, a notarized will dated 18 months earlier, signed, witnessed, and filed in accordance with Utah law. 2, a new power of attorney that revoked any prior ones, granting me full control over medical and financial decisions. 3, a property deed for a fully paid-off cabin tucked between the red rock cliffs of Kanab, Utah, with my name as sole owner. There were also bank statements from an account I'd never seen before. A quiet savings stash, likely from Dad's military pension and garage business, untouched by anyone but him. I sat on the floor, the documents spread around me like puzzle pieces, and I realized they thought they'd won, but the real war hadn't even started. The next week was a blur of legal filings. I contacted a probate attorney, a woman named Gina Kwan, a former JAG lawyer turned estate law expert. I handed her the folders. She read them in silence, then looked up and said, They don't have a case. The will Caleb and my mother planned to present was outdated, unsigned, unfiled, and lacked a second witness. Their power of attorney? Revoked. Their withdrawals? Unauthorized and likely illegal. I didn't call them. Didn't warn them. I let the court do that. When the official notice arrived, Caleb texted me, "WTF is this? Mom said you were out." I didn't reply. When they showed up to the probate hearing, late of course, Cynthia wore her designer sunglasses like it was opening night at the theater. She sat beside Caleb, smiling like nothing had happened, until my attorney submitted the original documents, until the judge reviewed the signatures, until the courtroom fell silent. And in that silence, I saw it. The exact moment Caleb realized he was no longer the favored one, not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of the father who gave everything to the daughter who stayed. They didn't speak to me after the hearing. Not a word in the hallway. Not a glance in the parking lot. Cynthia kept her head high, but I saw her hands trembling when she tried to light a cigarette with her manicured nails. Caleb shoved the court packet under his arm like it might vanish if he didn't read it. But the law doesn't vanish. It just takes its time. By the end of the month, the accounts had been fully transferred. My name on the deed, my name on the trust, their names on nothing. I didn't take it all. I followed the will exactly. But what they didn't know is that Dad's quiet accounts had already been drained by them. Vacation packages, designer bags, Caleb's failed security startup. They assumed the well would refill. They didn't know Dad had moved the bucket. The Range Rover, repossessed. The house, already mortgaged to the brink. Cynthia tried to sell her antiques to pay off debt, but they weren't worth what she'd claimed. Caleb applied for a loan to salvage things. Denied, pending legal review from the estate. He blamed me, naturally, but I didn't touch a cent they hadn't already spent. The final straw came when the house's plumbing collapsed, literally. A burst pipe in the basement destroyed what was left of the furnishings. Insurance didn't cover it. Neglect voids a lot of fine print. They had no choice but to sell fast and undervalue. Cynthia now rents a 2-bedroom condo near the interstate. No more porch, no more garden parties. Caleb moved in with a friend. At least, last I heard. And me, I didn't buy anything flashy, didn't gloat, didn't post. I simply packed my things, loaded the truck, and drove south with Miles. The cabin in Kanab wasn't big, but it was bright. There was a front porch with chipped paint and an old wooden swing that groaned just a little when you sat down. We hung Dad's flag on the rail, put his photo on the mantle, and in the hallway, right beside the front door, I framed his letter, the one that ended with, "You've already given more than anyone ever should. Now take what I left you, not as a reward but as relief." Miles built a fire that night. We drank tea from mismatched mugs. He looked over at me and said, "You okay?" And for the first time in years, I didn't have to lie. "Yeah," I said, "I think I finally am." I used to think an inheritance was something you could touch. A deed. A check. A set of keys dropped into your palm by someone who finally saw your worth. But sometimes, what you inherit isn't money. It's silence, peace, freedom from ever having to explain yourself again. There were no headlines, no apologies. Cynthia never called. Caleb tried once, a missed call I never returned. But word spreads in small towns, especially when it's about the people who used to stand tallest. The Blake family used to be admired. Now they're whispered about. "Did you hear? I thought she was cut out of the will." No, turns out she was the will. And I didn't correct anyone. Not because I was being cruel, but because I finally understood what Dad meant. Don't fight them. Don't scream. Just show them the paperwork and walk away. Because some people need revenge. Others just need a door to close behind them. Softly. Finally, we got married in the fall. It wasn't elaborate, just us, Miles' sister, my best friend from law school, and a local judge who cried more than I did. I wore a simple ivory dress and pinned Dad's military pin to the inside of my jacket. Miles wore the suit he had tailored for funerals and swore he'd never use it for anything else again. We said our vows under a cottonwood tree, not far from where the sun hit the porch each morning. There were no empty chairs, no performative smiles, just peace and presence. Sometimes I still wake up expecting a fight. An email, a text, a guilt trip in the shape of a family photo. But then I see the cabin ceiling, hear Miles humming in the kitchen, and I remember I don't owe anyone an explanation, because I didn't win. I didn't conquer, I just stayed. Stayed when it got hard. Stayed when it wasn't fair. Stayed when love looked like pushing a wheelchair down a gravel path and wiping soup off a man's chin who couldn't say thank you anymore, but didn't have to. So if you're out there, if you've ever been erased from your family's version of the story, if you did the work, carried the weight, and never got a seat at the table, this one is for you. You don't have to shout. You don't have to justify. You don't even have to answer their call. You just have to remember, some people inherit houses, but the lucky ones, they inherit themselves, and that is enough.